Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna read another book in English and the title is Puss in Boots. Let's start. Once upon a time there was a miller who had 3 sons. He was so poor that when he died he left nothing but his mill, his donkey and his cat. The mill, of course, had to be left to his eldest son. The donkey went to his second son. Then all that was left for the youngest son was his father's cat. Alas, sighed the youngest son. Puss is no use to me, and I'm too poor even to feed him. Do not worry, dear master, said the cat. Give me a pair of boots and a bag, and you will find that we are not as badly off as you think. The miller's son was very surprised to hear a cat talk. A cat that can talk is perhaps clever enough to do as he promises, he thought to himself. So, with his last few coins, the miller's son bought Puss a pair of boots and a bag. Puss was delighted with the boots. He pulled them on and strutted up and down in front of his master. He looked so proud of himself that the miller's son could not help but laugh at him. From that time onwards, the miller's son always called him Puss in Boots. Then Puss slung the bag over his shoulder and went off to the garden. There he gathered some fresh lettuce leaves, which he put in his bag. Next, Puss in Boots set off across the fields. He stopped when he came to a rabbit hole. Then, leaving the mouth of his bag open, he lay quietly down nearby. A plump rabbit soon peeped out of the hole. It smelled the fresh lettuce leaves and came nearer. They were too tempting. First, the rabbit's nose went into the bag, and then its head. Puss quickly pulled the strings, and the rabbit was caught. With the rabbit in his bag, Puss in Boots marched off to the palace and asked to see the king. When he was brought before him, he made a low bow and said, "Your Majesty, please accept this rabbit as a gift from my lord, the Marquis of Carabas." The king was amused by this cat wearing boots and talking. "Tell your master," he said, "that I accept his gift, and I am much obliged." On another day, Puss again lay down as he were dead in a field. Once more, his bag was open beside him. This time, he caught 2 fine partridge. Again, Puss in Boots took his catch to the king. As before, the king accepted the gift from the Marquis of Carabas. He was so pleased with the partridge that he ordered the cat to be taken to a royal kitchen and fed. As it happened, the king had a daughter who was said to be the most beautiful princess in the world. One day, Puss in Boots heard that the king and his daughter were going for a drive along by the river. Puss ran immediately to the miller's son and said, "My master, if you will not do as I tell you, your future will be made." "What would you have me to do?" asked the miller's son. "Come with me, my master," replied Puss, and led him to the bank of the river. "There are only two things I want you to do," said the cat. "First, you must bath here in the river. Secondly, you must believe that you are not yourself, but the Marquis of Carabas." "I have never heard of Marquis of Carabas," said the miller's son, "but I will do as you say." While the miller's son was bathing in the river, the royal carriages came into the sight. The king was in his carriage with his daughter beside him. His nobles were riding behind. Suddenly they were startled by a cry of help. "Help! Help, my lord! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning!" The king, looking out of his carriage, could see no one but Puss in Boots, who was running up and down beside the river. However, the king told his nobles to run quickly to help the drowning man. Puss ran back to the king as soon as the nobles had dragged his master from the river. Making a low bow, he said, "Your Majesty, what shall my poor master do, for a thief has stolen his clothes?" Now the truth was that Puss in Boots has hidden the clothes under a large stone. "That is the most unfortunate," said the king. "We cannot leave him there without clothes." So he gave orders to a servant to fetch a suit from the palace. When the miller's son was dressed in a suit of good clothes, he looked a very fine man indeed. The king then invited him to go for a drive with them. So the miller's son sat in the carriage beside the princess. Puss ran on quickly ahead of the carriage. He stopped when he reached a meadow where the mowers were cutting the grass. Puss spoke to the mowers. "The king is coming this way, and he might ask you whose meadow this is. Unless you say that it belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, you shall all be chopped as fine as mincemeat." The mowers were simply fellows, and they were terrified to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. A few minutes later, the king and his nobles drove by, and the king passed the large, lovely meadow. He stopped his carriage and spoke to the mowers. "Tell me," he asked, "who owns this fine meadow?" "It belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, your Majesty," replied the mowers. At that the king turned to the miller's son. "You do indeed own a fine meadow, my lord," he said. Meanwhile, Puss had run farther on along the road. He reached a cornfield in which reapers were busy cutting the corn. "The king will soon drive by," said Puss to the reapers. "He might ask whose cornfields these are. Unless you say that they belong to the Marquis of Carabas, you shall all be chopped as fine as mincemeat." The reapers, just like the mowers, were terrified to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. A few minutes later, the king and all his nobles came into sight. Once more the king stopped his carriage. "Tell me," he said to the reapers, "who owns these cornfields?" "They belong to the Marquis of Carabas," replied the reapers. "What a rich man he must be, and how handsome he looks," said the king to himself. "I do believe he would make a good husband for my daughter." Now the fields really belonged to an ogre, and this ogre lived in a castle a little farther along. Puss in Boots hurried along the road until he reached the castle. Then he knocked on the door, which was opened by the ogre himself. "Sir," said Puss, "I am on a journey, and as I have often heard how wonderful you are, I have taken the liberty of calling to see you." The ogre was startled to hear a cat talking, yet he was pleased to learn that the cat had heard how wonderful he was. He immediately invited Puss into the castle. "I have heard," said Puss, "that you can change yourself into any animal you choose." "That is true," replied the ogre, and he instantly changed himself into a lion. Puss got a terrible fright. He quickly scrambled to the top of a very high dresser, out of harm's way. At once the ogre changed himself from a lion back to an ogre again. Whereupon Puss jumped down. "Sir, I must tell you that you frightened me," said Puss. "Yet it must not be too difficult for such a big fellow as yourself to change into a large animal like a lion." "It would be even more wonderful if a huge ogre could change himself into a tiny animal," went on Puss. "I suppose you could not, for instance, change yourself into a mouse?" "Could not?" cried the ogre. "I can change myself into anything I choose. You shall see." Immediately he became a little gray mouse which scampered across the floor in front of Puss in Boots. With one spring, Puss pounced upon the mouse and gobbled it up. So there was an end to the ogre. They all entered the castle where they... Just one second. By this time, the king's carriage were arriving at the castle. Puss in Boots, hearing the carriage wheels, ran to the gate. Bowing low, he said, "Welcome, your majesty, to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." "What, my lord?" cried the king, turning to the miller's son. "Does this castle also belong to you? I have nothing so grand in my whole kingdom." The miller's son did not speak, but gave his hand to the princess to help her from the carriage. They all entered the castle, where they found a wonderful feast ready to be served. It had been prepared for guests whom the ogre had expected. Fortunately, the ogre's friends did not arrive, as news had reached them that the king was in the castle. The king and the princess, the nobles, and the miller's son all sat down to the feast. Puss in Boots stood by the side of his master. Every moment the king became more and more charmed with the miller's son. When the feast was over, the king said to him, "There is no one in the world I would rather have as my son-in-law. I now make you a prince." Then the prince said that there was no one in the world he would like so much for his wife as the princess. And the princess said there was no one in the world she would like so much for a husband as a prince. So the two were married and lived happily ever after in the ogre's castle. Puss in Boots was very happy living in the castle. He was always the greatest favorite with the king, the prince, and the princess. Never again had Puss to hunt for a meal. He lived on the fat of the land until the end of his days. This is the end of our story. See you next time. Bye bye.